What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and away from the recording studio today, traveling for event coverage. I'm going to be at the Iron Weld 11th Edition GT, where I'm live streaming all weekend, Friday through Sunday. So please come check me out over on my live tab. But otherwise, we did just get in the last 24 hours a big preview of what is going to be an upcoming FAQ for Warhammer 40K. This is obviously preceding next week's Tacoma Open, which is a Games Workshop Open event being held in Washington. And unfortunately, with the state of 11th edition currently, there are a ton of outstanding rules questions that the Tacoma Open needs to answer. So we just got this FAQ. And while the FAQ document does state that it is official only for Warhammer 40,000 Tacoma, this was actually sent to event organizers and tournament organizers in an email and specifies that because the Tacoma Open will land before the release of the planned July update to Warhammer 40,000, the Warhammer Studio and Warhammer Global Events team have created an FAQ covering some of the most asked questions from the players. With the full rules update coming this month, it will cover these questions as well as more that have been raised by Warhammer 40,000 players over the few weeks of the new edition. So in the context, essentially, this isn't official rules. However, it will soon become official rules effectively in one form or another. I take this to mean that this FAQ document is not in its finalized state. It, of course, does not cover all of the open questions that we have for Warhammer 40,000 11th edition. However, it's likely that most of the rules that we see here are going to be included in the next FAQ document. So if I were to be planning an event in the next week or two, I guess before the end of July, I would most likely implement these because I would expect these to become codified in core rules as we see a new update take shape. And the Ironwell GT that I'm streaming this weekend has already announced that they're going to be implementing these changes. Now, we can go through these and talk about how they're going to be changing the game. The first thing is a rule update about generating command points. This is a big one. Excluding the core command point, each player can gain a maximum of 1 command point per battle round. This includes the command points gained when a player discards an active secondary mission card. This was an oversight in the core rules, unfortunately, a very embarrassing one for Games Workshop. They forgot to specify in the command point rules that you can only gain 1 command point in addition to your core command points. Now, everyone, I think, assumed that this was going to be the case. It's been the case for several editions, and there was text inside some of the event packets that referenced a cap to command point generation that it did not exist in the core rules, in fact. So modifying stratagem's command point cost, rules that enable you to target a friendly unit with a stratagem for 0 CP, but do not specify the name of that stratagem. Instead, reduce the command point cost of that stratagem by 1. In some cases, there were rules that Games Workshop, I think, forgot to errata. Most things that gave you a free stratagem did give you a reduced cost stratagem. There obviously were open questions how that worked with increased cost effects, like Agents of Vect, auras, essentially. But there were also, I think, some instances of stuff like Heroic Intervention that let you use it for 0 CP, which could allow you to use the Into the Fray mode, the 2 command point mode for Heroic Intervention for 0 instead of for 1, whereas the intention was that it was meant to be used for 1. Also, a restriction here on normal moves. When a unit ends a normal move, it cannot make another more normal move in that phase. That's to prevent multiple stacked reactive effects. In some cases, there are some situations where either you could trigger multiple reactive moves off of 1 or 2 separate triggers, or in some cases, you could actually trigger reactive moves during your movement phase in response to the opposing reactive moves. So that was a rule in 10th edition, and it's just being recodified. Stratagems that can be used more than once per phase or turn. Parts of rule allow a player to use a stratagem even if they've already targeted another unit with that stratagem in the same phase. These can only be used if the name of the stratagem is specified in that rule. Similarly, if a stratagem is limited to 1 use per player turn, per battle round, or per battle, such parts of that rule can only be used if the name of the stratagem is specified in that rule. I think this is a catch-all for the original verbiage of stuff like Rites of Battle that allowed you to use a stratagem more than once but didn't specify which particular stratagem it was. We had a rule in 10th edition that required a stratagem to be specifically named to be used more than once, and I think this is just adding that back into the rules text. Stratagems add new units to your army army. If a stratagem has the effect of adding a new unit to your army that is identical to your destroyed unit, add the following restriction to the stratagem. It can only be used once per battle. So this affects things like Astra Militarum's reinforcements, for example, which already had this restriction from last edition, and I guess they're just re-importing it because some of these changes were likely not included in faction packs for all of the factions that had these particular styles of effects. Stratagems that prevent units from being targeted. If a stratagem that has an effect that says a target unit can only be selected as the target of a ranged attack if the attacking model is within 12. The effect is changed to say it can only be selected as the target of a ranged attack if the attacking model is within 18. What I wish they would do with these, and it kind of irks me that they don't, is change these styles of stratagems to provide the lone operative X ability, which is just in the rules. They could just add it in there, until the end of that phase, and they don't, and that is a little bit frustrating. They have like a rules umbrella that can cover situations like these, but they don't use it for whatever reason. But again, this is an update that happened in a balance document in the 10th edition, and I think a lot of those changes were reverted because the balance data slate has been removed with the release of the new edition. Some similar stuff here. Grenade and Tank Shock both refers to the explosives and crushing impact stratagems because those were renamed in the new edition, and they forgot to retitle them in abilities and stuff. So the argument obviously was made. If you used, for example, Tank Shock for free, like a Cerastus Knight Lancer, you could not, in fact, use the crushing impact stratagem, despite the fact that the stratagem that the ability previously referred to didn't exist anymore. So it was pretty clearly what the intention was, but obviously they do need to codify it inside the rules. Effects that cause desperate escape tests now force both a hazard roll for each model in the unit and a battle shock roll for the unit. So basically forcing your opponent to take all of the downsides of taking a desperate breakout in the new rules context, but the desperate escape test mechanic was removed in the new edition. That actually doesn't refer to anything anymore. Controlling objective at the end of the phase, the end of each player's phase and turn, the first thing the player does before any other at the end of phase or at the end of turn rules or abilities is to determine which objectives are controlled by which player. So this is an interesting errata. Basically, it means that you can't sequence end of turn effects before you check level of control on an objective. So, for example, if I have reanimation protocols, which is an ability that triggers at the end of the Necron player's command phase, normally the standard trigger for it is at the end of the command phase, then I would check level of control before I would activate reanimation protocols. Now, I believe that this is actually directly contradictory to the core rules. The core rules do say that any non-player controlled mission effects, which it was kind of nebulous whether or not that did include level of control calculation, because that's a core rule, not necessarily a mission rule. I mean, it's a core rule revolving around objectives and objective control, which is, of course, how missions work. Confusing. There was a rule that said that always occurred at the end of the phase before any triggers occur. However, 0805 end of command phase first resolve rules triggered at this point other than mission rules. So this would incorporate things like reanimation protocols, for example. Then both players consult their mission if one or more players have achieved any aspects of their mission that are triggered, resolve them now. The implication here was that this also encompassed level of control, but obviously that's like kind of an open question. However, it seems like this is clarified that this is obviously when you would check your end of phase victory point scoring. However, level of control at this stage would already have been calculated. So if you have end of command phase abilities that bring models back or change your objective control characteristics, for example, that actually wouldn't change level of control for the purposes of scoring, which is kind of a huge deal. And I think a lot of what they're doing in this case is basically curtailing the power of reanimation style armies that are trying to just play with recursive models to the point that they can sort of force primary objective control. Recursive models, I think, are already powerful in 11th edition because Purge the Foe and many other secondaries already require you to destroy units, and units that can regenerate themselves and are already very difficult to kill are already powerful without also giving them this control over primary objectives. Not to mention the fact that it was a popular, relatively powerful in some metagames, and also kind of like a zero-sum archetype for gameplay. One player got to regenerate a bunch of models, and the other player got to watch their primary score get tanked. That's a very interesting, I guess it's not really a change, but it is, I guess, a clarification that end of command phase effects cannot change your level of control over objectives. Kind of a big deal. At the end of transport capacity, friendly unit must be embarked within a friendly dedicated transport model. At the end of the step, each friendly dedicated transport model without an embarked unit is destroyed. But they do not trigger rules that are triggered when a model is destroyed. Yeah, I think they forgot to add this section into the dedicated transport rules, unfortunately. That was a present in 10th edition, and they forgot to add it in 11th edition, but it has been returned, it seems like, or it is returning, I guess. Moving section of objective consolidation. The unit must be unengaged within range of the selected objective, which is a recorded video about the fight phase rules, and the objective consolidation rules are a little bit weird, where it is possible to engage enemies using objective consolidation. However, the rules don't allow those enemies to fight you back. Only the engaging consolidation moves allow you to move into engagement range of an enemy and then allow those enemies to fight. There's obviously a cleanup of that. However, I do believe that ongoing consolidation could allow you to bring new enemies into the fight and allow them to fight. So this doesn't really address the core issue, which is that consolidations can bring enemies into engagement, but not allow them to fight in many cases. Both ongoing consolidation and objective consolidation, the way the core rules are written, allow you to engage new enemies. However, only engaging consolidation allows those enemies to fight you. And I believe that the way the rules are written is that a unit is eligible to fight if it is engaged during the fight phase, but its chance to be selected to fight has actually passed when you get to the consolidation step. Now, if you use engaging consolidation to choose an enemy within 3 inches and then move towards them, that can allow them to fight in the after moving section here. However, the other modes don't actually say that, which does feel like an oversight to me. And this is a little bit of a stopgap, I guess, that objective consolidation must end unengaged, but I don't think we have any other changes to an ongoing consolidation. Let's see. No, yeah, there's no changes to ongoing consolidation. So there are still, this does sort of seal the loophole where an engaging or an objective consolidation could pull a new enemy into combat, but not allow them to fight, although it doesn't change the fact that in an ongoing consolidation, you could potentially do that. Effects that revive destroyed character models. Now, obviously, this is a huge issue, I think, in the rules right now. There's a bunch of ways to bring back character models, and in some cases, those character models can also bring back models in their character units, which can make this kind of like ongoing sequence where at least once per game, the character and the entire bodyguard unit is allowed to be destroyed, and then the bodyguard unit can be revived over time, which probably not the play pattern that Games Workshop would love to see right now, because we are seeing these like Awakened Dynasty lists, for example, that are bringing a bunch of little individual characters that can respawn their entire unit when they're destroyed. So when you revive a destroyed character model, we're changing the text of how you return the destroyed character model to play to the following. You set up the destroyed model on the battlefield unengaged and as close as possible to where it was destroyed. That model is not part of an attached unit and has a starting strength of 1. So this allows you to remove destroyed character models from the game entirely. Now, obviously, all these stratagems have different timings, very slightly different timings, which is a little bit awkward, but I guess replacing the effect wholesale definitely cleans things up quite a bit. This is a massive depowerment in how powerful these stratagems are, because in no cases at that point would you be allowed to revive models back to a bodyguard unit if the character deattaches from the bodyguard unit when it revives. This does stop a weird interaction that could happen in some cases where a character actually, because they are required to set back up into coherency with models in the unit that are on the battlefield, you could open situations where during the course of a phase, a unit could change its position pretty dramatically on the table, and it would actually allow you to basically teleport the character, sometimes as much as like 12 inches across the battlefield. Now, because they're no longer part of the attached unit, they just set back up where they were standing and become their own unit. There are some weird situations here where it now allows you to basically construct new units. So in some cases, you could, for example, have a character that has been precisioned out of a unit. You can use a stratagem that triggers when a character model is destroyed to regenerate them. In some cases, this is not the case. Divine Intervention, for example, triggers when the unit is destroyed, not the individual model. So this, in fact, would not be possible for that stratagem in specific, but some of them trigger when your units are destroyed. You then end up becoming a separate unit and being able to go on your own way and do your own thing. But I do think that the empowerment of these like massively powerful recursive mechanics is generally going to be positive for the game. Healing or regaining wounds. Change one bullet point as follows. When a unit heals or regains a number of wounds, it regains up to that total number of lost wounds. For each wound healed or regained, consult the following. If that unit has has one or more models that do not have its full wounds remaining. Select one of those models. The model can regains one wound. If all models in the unit have their starting number of wounds, but one or more models from the unit are currently destroyed, revive one of those destroyed models, excluding characters. So this is another huge depowerment to almost explicitly Necrons. I think they were the only faction that had this kind of like recursive wound regaining that didn't specify specific models. So most of the things, and I got this question a million times since the edition started, is like, oh man, can I use, for example, a Tech Marine on a multi-unit of vehicles, a multi-model vehicle unit, to then revive vehicle models? And the answer is no, because almost 99% of those effects say choose a model in the unit. That specific model regains lost wounds. If they would say the unit regains lost wounds, then you could revive new models back to the unit under the new rules. However, 99% of the case, you couldn't do that. The basically one exception was Necrons. Necrons regain wounds using reanimation protocols. Anytime that a unit reanimates, it uses the regaining lost wounds sort of rules. And this prevents the Necron characters from coming back. It means that precision went from, in 10th edition, being the sort of the silver bullet, to Necron sort of brick combos, where you could put a bunch of characters together, you could enhance those characters, you could make them super duper powerful, and then you would, sort of jank up the survivability of your unit, and then as long as those characters survived, your units would stick around for a really long time. In 11th edition, they changed the rules, of course, to allow models to return when you regained wounds. That allowed you, because the character was embedded into the unit and never separated from the unit, that allowed you to regenerate the character even if it was precisioned out. So it made precision from this like silver bullet to a lot of these combinations to being basically useless. Essentially, it's just this worthless ability again. And I'm glad that they're returning it in this way. This does feel pretty heavy-handed, just having basically no way to return a character model back to their parent unit. However, I do think that it allows them to more appropriately point these character combinations for things that, for example, regenerate bodyguard models, because there is counterplay to those, which I think is helpful. Genestealer Cult's Cult Ambush has been reworked to be functional, I guess. When checking if every model in if a destroyed unit has a Cult Ambush ability, exclude attached character models. When determining how many resurgence points to spend, exclude attached character models. When adding a unit to your army identical to the destroyed unit, exclude attached character models. This is a huge oversight in the Genestealer Cult's army rule. Basically said that if you had a character in your unit, you could never, ever use the Cult Ambush on them, because none of the characters in the Codex had the Cult Ambush ability. And now that units are destroyed alongside their characters, not after their characters or before their characters, the rule was essentially non-functional. That was a huge oversight. So I'm glad that is being addressed. Setting up large models from Strategic Reserve. If a model is so large its base cannot physically be set up wholly within the distance required of the battlefield edge, it must be set up so that it is touching the battlefield edge during a turn in which a large model is set up on the battlefield, excluding aircraft models. Models unit cannot do any of the following: make moves or make attacks with ranged weapons. Some large models, typically aircraft, have wings and other parts that extend significantly beyond their base. Such models can overhang a battlefield edge if it is not possible to set them up otherwise, but when setting them up, they must still be more than 8 inches away from all enemy models. This allows aircraft models on a base larger than 6 inches to make ranged attacks with ranged weapons on a turn, which they're set up on the battlefield. This was another big oversight. There was, I think, a position where a lot of the large, like 130 millimeter based aircraft models could attack if they were wholly within 2 battlefield edges, because the Strategic Reserve rules have changed to say that you must set up wholly within 6 inches of 1 or more battlefield edges. So if you were wholly within 6 inches of 2 battlefield edges, you could shoot, but it explicitly only allowed those vehicles to set up in the corners, not anywhere else. And if you were frame keyworded, you were probably out of luck, which most of the aircraft ended up getting. However, as we'll talk about momentarily, that is being reworked. I do like this change quite a bit. I do think that aircraft are of limited functionality in 11th edition. Definitely not the worst thing ever. Like, you can play them and they're okay. I think in general they're overcosted and they don't necessarily need to be anymore. However, this was just this big sort of Damocles hanging over this entire keyword, because in some cases it would just, kill your ability to actually place your miniature. Now, obviously there have been huge changes to the frame keyword. Basically, they've gone through and either added or removed the frame keyword based on the type of unit that you are. So in a lot of cases, there were things like aircraft that gained the frame keyword. In addition, a lot of non-vehicle, non-monsters gained frame. So the big example here is the Shield Captain Dawn Eagle Jetbike and Virtus Praetors. I believe that also Screamers of Tzeentch got it as well. I have to imagine that this is kind of an ever-present battle between some sort of like brand team, the rules team, because they were added just a couple weeks ago when the edition came out, when the the app was updated. They just sort of willy-nilly added frame to random things in the faction packs. What frame does is that it kind of recontextualizes what you could potentially use as a stand-in for that miniature. So for example, if I had a frame keyworded, light vehicle or something, because it has such an impact on what my model can look like when it's on the table and how it has to conform, around terrain and with measurements and line of sight and things like that, it does put pressure on a player to play the official and correct model. However, I do think that in a lot of these cases, so things like Screamers of Tzeentch, for example, are a little guy on a round base with a big giant tail. And the same goes for these Virtus Praetors, for example, as well. These are like a little biker guy. I mean, they're not that small. They're custodians, but they're big on a bike, but they have a big extended spear. And the problem is that the way the rules work in 11th edition, when you rotate a model that has a base, regardless of whether or not it frame measures, you always rotate it from the center of the base, which allows frame measuring asymmetric units like that to gain massive amounts of additional movement because they can rotate themselves and then rotate that tail or that spear or something around and then use that for measurement. So for example, if I was a Screamer of Tzeentch and I wanted to go get an objective in order to perform an action or something, I could move and then spin myself around off my base to put my tail onto the objective and then, use my OC on that objective. Or I could move and then spin myself around to get additional distance, then charge, for example. So these created these like really obnoxious gameplay issues. And it feels to me like in some cases that I imagine there's like some sort of brand manager somewhere who's like, we should add frame keyword to more things to encourage people to not use stand-ins. And then there's also like the organized play team and the rules design team who are like, please don't, please stop. It is the worst. It sucks so hard. They also added it to a bunch of aircraft, and I have a whole video about how degenerate hull measurement on Games Workshop's aircraft models are. There was an issue with a Storm Raven gunship a couple years ago that ended up having a player receive a lifetime ban from a particular event circuit. It was wild because of just the way that aircraft and sort of hover vehicle mechanics worked with hull measurement. They've, in this case, removed the frame keyword from all of these models, and I would not be shocked to see if this does end up getting locked in. Now, they've also added the frame keyword to a bunch of different models. That includes a bunch of the Eldari vehicles, Decan platforms, Falcon, Fire Prism, Night Spinner, Shadow Weaver platform, Star Weaver, Fiber Cannon, Void Weaver, Wave Serpent, Yunari Raider, Yunari Venom, and Doomsday Arc all had forgotten to have the frame keyword added, so they actually base measured, which of course was an oversight, especially in the case of like the Doomsday Arc and the Falcon and Fire Prism. Those are massive models that wildly overhang their base. There's no way we can play them as a hull measure without as a base measure without using hull measurement. Absolutely insane. They've also added the mobile keyword to Tulia Gold, Belisarius Call, Lionel Johnson, Fulgrim, Rabute Gilliman, and the Red Terror. Now, both Fulgrim and the Red Terror had, Red Terror essentially has mobile on her data sheet as a result of her special abilities. Fulgrim has something similar, but I think it does require that terrain features be of a certain height. However, they had removed entirely the ability for things like Belisarius Call or the Loyalist Primarchs to move through terrain features. Now, moving through terrain features is not as big of a deal in 11th edition as it is in 10th, but I do think it helps out the playability of those models quite a bit, because we have been seeing a lot of people eschew the new Primarchs for just more efficient infantry and stuff, and I would hazard a guess that this is part of it. Not being able to charge through like walls in the corners of ruins and stuff is obviously a big deal for something like Lionel Johnson or Rabute Gilliman. FAQs. When my unit shoots another unit, how does it work if some of the models in the unit are fully visible to some models in my unit, while others are within a terrain feature or not fully visible? The answer is that for each attacking model in your unit, determine whether or not the target has the benefit of cover, as described in Terrain of Visibility. In this scenario, the target unit will likely have the benefit of cover against some of the attacking models, but not all. This means that, in an example where all the attacking models are using the same weapon, when you get to the resolve attack step of the attack sequence, you will collect dice for attacks made by models against which the target unit has the benefit of cover separately from the dice for attacks made by models against which the target unit does not have the benefit of cover. This was the biggest question that I've gotten on every single video I've made, rules video I've made in 11th edition so far, is how this works and why it works this way. I actually have an explainer video that's a follow-up to that video, but both WTC and now, of course, the GW events team have released these examples of the way that this is supposed to work. For some reason, people still don't believe me, But this is, in fact, the way it's supposed to work because you determine visibility from each attacking model in a unit that's attacking an opposing unit, and the target benefits from cover only if it has the one of the cover benefiting effects applying to every model in it. In response to that specific attack, it imposes a statistical modifier or a profile modifier on that one attack, right? So a guy with a bolter shooting into cover would be -1 ballistic skill from a guy with a bolter shooting at a unit for which against whom like one of those models is out of line or out in the open, in line of sight, which means that they form separate attack pools. And this is pretty explicit in the rules. There's some diagrams that I think were confusing people, so it's good that we got this clarification as an FAQ. But yeah, this has always been how it's worked. So I'm glad that we are getting like from official sources an example that this is in fact the correct case. And I actually watched some other videos of people discussing this interaction, and I also saw them struggling to explain to people that this is in fact how that works. People didn't believe them. My unit has an ability that allows it to disembark from a transport after the transport has performed an advanced move. What mode of disembark move do I use with this ability? You will automatically select the rapid disembark mode and follow the while moving and after moving steps of that mode accordingly. This is a very good clarification. Essentially, the rules as written is that because disembark moves check down a checklist, whether or not you have sort of made a move this turn. And unfortunately, the way that the rules were written is that basically if you had the ability to disembark after advancing, you cut out this like has not made an advance move this turn section. Then you go down the checklist and you don't use rapid disembark because you haven't made a normal or ingress move. You go to see if you're doing tactical disembark. You don't use tactical disembark because you didn't remain stationary and you have been selected to move already. So you would automatically do combat disembark, which had like so much rules context available to it. Just clarifying that you are supposed to be Just clarifying here that you are supposed to be doing rapid disembark makes so much more sense, right? It makes those abilities functional. Otherwise, you would like become battle shocked and like you lose all your objective control characteristic and a bunch of other stuff, which is very stupid, which is I think clearly unintended, but the way the rules were written. So this is a nice change. After using an ability that increases the command point cost of a stratagem, if my opponent does not have the necessary command points available for the stratagem, what happens? This is actually explicit in the core rules, so it's a good clarification. No command points are spent and the stratagem's effects are not resolved, but the stratagem kill still counts as having been used this phase. And that is explicitly what happens if when you go to use a stratagem, you don't have enough command points for it. This was also the case in some cases in 10th edition if you had selective abilities that would increase the cost of specific stratagems. Now, basically every command point increase effect works that way, so this is a much more important clarification. After using an ability that increases the command point cost of a stratagem, must my opponent continue to use the selected stratagem at the increased cost if they have the necessary command points available? The answer is yes. So basically, this is saying that if I am within range of an agent's effect that can increase the cost of my stratagem by once per turn, and I have one command point, and I go to use a one command point stratagem, and my opponent chooses to use agent's effect on it, I would end up spending 0 because the cost would increase from 1 to 2. I would check my command point total, not have enough command points, and it would fizzle essentially. However, it means that I could not use that stratagem for the remainder of the phase, and because I had already targeted the stratagem, I could not target that unit with a secondary stratagem later on in that phase. However, if I have 2 command points instead of 1, then because I've already declared the stratagem use would continue, and I would spend all of my command points effectively. So very nice little clarifications for these. When does a flying unit choose to take to the skies? It is when you are selected to make a normal advance or fallback or charge move. In the case of advance or charge move, it means you must decide to take to the skies before rolling the advance or charge move. That is explicit in the take to the skies rules. How do modifiers to the charge roll or the maximum distance of the charge move, such as take to the skies, impact the selection of charge targets? This is another one that is explicit in the core rules, but you have to read a little bit into them. A charging unit may only select charge targets that are within the maximum distance of their charge roll, including any modifiers. If such a modifier occurs after selecting a target that causes the target to no longer be within its maximum distance, the charging unit would then select new targets. Based on rule 040303, target no longer eligible or viable. So this was to say if you have an effect that says, like a grav inhibitor drone, charges targeting this unit suffer -2 to their charge roll. Basically, you'd make your charge roll that would be influencing your maximum distance. And if you selected a unit with a grav inhibitor drone, it would reduce your charge roll by 2, meaning that the target of the grav inhibitor drone would no longer be an eligible target, so you would have to reselect a new target. It essentially makes you untargetable for charges that would not reach you with that -2 involved, but it doesn't cause your charge to automatically fail. If you have two things in range, you can select the other thing if something would modify your charge roll. They give an example. A unit's charge roll is 7 and has a datasheet ability which adds +1 to its charge rolls. That charge roll's maximum distance are 8 and may select targets within 8 inches. Or a flying unit chooses to take the skies, rolls a charge roll of 9. The charge's maximum distance is 7. It may select targets within 2 inches. There are some clarifications to upgrades. These are actually big changes. Essentially, everyone that I spoke to previously, and this was the case for, I believe, WTC judges ruled this way, as well as ATC, that an epic hero unit cannot have an enhancement within it. The rules are very vague and unfortunately poorly written. It just says that epic heroes cannot be given enhancements or cannot have enhancements, I think, is after you form attached units. It didn't specify whether that affected models, units, or components of an attached unit. So this clarification here represents a kind of a paradigm shift in how epic heroes work alongside other characters. A unit cannot have both an upgrade and an enhancement. You're prevented from having two enhancements, and upgrades are enhancements. Upgrade are in type of enhancements, but not all enhancements or upgrades. An attached unit can be given an upgrade. An epic hero can form an attached unit with a unit that has an enhancement. What they don't clarify here, and this is the problematic part, is that if an epic hero joins a unit with an upgrade, that epic hero would gain that upgrade. So the epic heroes can't have attachments or can't have enhancements rule would theoretically come into effect. So the epic heroes can't have enhancements rule would come into effect and would actually prevent that attachment. They don't clarify here if that is the case, and this is very important for some stuff, especially like Space Wolves, for example, who have a lot of character units that they want to form with Terminators, and they have a million enhancements for Terminators. And if you can't put Logan Grimnar or whatever into your Terminator squads because they have upgrades, it's a big deal. So this does require further clarification. This is something I hope they will further clarify inside the next July update, because unfortunately the muster armies rules are written extremely poorly. The implication is that they're written as a sequence, and that upgrading your units is the last step of the sequence after you choose your attachments. However, they don't actually specify that. They just sort of imply it. And so different places have been ruling it different ways, and it just needs to be cleaned up quite a bit. This goes a little bit of the way, but still it leaves up some open questions. My unit began the game on the battlefield and was subsequently placed in strategic reserves during the first battle round. May that unit perform an ingress move to return to the battlefield during the first battle round? The answer is no. Ingress moves explicitly prevent you from using them in the first battle round, unless you have an ability which requires them to do so. They give some examples here. The long and short of it is that if you have an effect that requires you to return to the battlefield at a specified timing, and that timing occurs within the first battle round, you are allowed to ingress move. Otherwise, the game breaks, right? You have a required game action that you're required to take, but you also have another effect that says you can't do that, right? So you need one of them has to give. So if, for example, you say I have, like, Demonic Incursion, for example, has a stratagem that says I pick up 2 units and they return during my next movement phase at the end of your opponent's turn, then if you use that at the top of turn 1, then go to bottom of turn 1, and it's your movement phase, those units must return. There is no other legal timing for them to come back, so they are allowed to perform ingress moves. However, if you have an ability on the first battle round that says I go into strategic reserve but doesn't tell you how you return, those units must come in on battle round 2. An example is like Gate of Infinity from Grey Knights, which just says select a number of units, they go into strat reserve. My unit has an ability which triggers when making a save roll for a specific model in the unit, or when rolling a specific type of save, e.g. an invulnerable save. Yeah, an invulnerable save doesn't exist anymore in 11th edition, so there's a lot of things that sort of target specifically invulnerable saves. And unfortunately, we don't really have a clarification on how that works, because having an inv save characteristic now means that any unmodified dice roll of that result automatically pass your saving throw. It's not a specific type of roll that you choose to make. It's just essentially a modifier to your normal save rolls. Instead of following the normal sequence, if you roll equal to or above your inv save characteristic, your save is passed, regardless of AP modifiers or whatever. The answer here is to treat these abilities as being active only when the models that are the source of the ability are part of the current allocation group at the time saves are rolled. In most cases, this will mean that models would need to be in the first allocation group. Ignore any references to specific type of save rolls for the purposes of such abilities. So in this case, for example, Blade Guard veterans, I think, are a good example. They have reroll 1s on invulnerable saves specifically. I guess what they are saying here is that if the Blade Guard veterans themselves are in the current in allocation group 1, they will be subject to the ability as soon as that allocation group is removed, however, I think you actually lose the ability. So this is a little bit of a nerf in some cases to things like Blade Guard veteran stances. Even though like a Blade Guard veteran unit says that models in this unit reroll ones for invuln saves, I guess this FAQ is saying that will no longer apply to the entirety of the unit. They will apply to only the Blade Guard veterans, even if the rules as written in the ability would affect your attached character models, which I think is a pretty reasonable resolution to that ability. It basically, you end up side grading it because previously it only affected specific types of saves. It was only when you took your 4+ invulnerable save instead of your 3+ armor save in that like specific instance, but it affected your attached characters when they took invuln saves in a single combat activation because it affected you for the entire phase. Now it only ever affects Blade Guard veterans, but it allows you to take that reroll ones even if you are not taking what is nominally an invulnerable save. An example is an Archon with a Shadow Field attached to a unit of Cabalite Warriors and rolling 12 saves. The controlling player sets the Cabalite Warriors as the first allocation group and the Archon as the second, then rolls their 12 saves. The Archon's Shadow Field ability, which prevents rerolling invulnerable saves made for the Archon, is not active, as the Archon is not the current allocation group. The controlling player may choose to reroll one of these saves if they choose inside the other model's allocation group. How do miracle dice work during an attack sequence? During the attack sequence, when an Adeptus Sororitas attacking unit, an Adeptus Sororitas player's attack unit can use an active faith when making hit rolls, or they can substitute a dice from any given group of attacks before making wound rolls, or they can substitute or damage rolls, and they can substitute a dice for a single damage roll before making that roll. Yeah, damage rolls are always resolved sequentially because damage from failed saves are resolved one at a time. They're allocated and then resolved one at a time by the defending player. So you don't get to see all of your damage results at the time that you choose to use miracle dice or command rerolls, for example. So if you end up like rolling all of your damage dice, for example, against a single target and then rerolling one of them, that is technically not legal. For the purposes of VP scoring limits, is the end of the battle the same timing as the end of the 5th battle round. No victory points scored at the end of the battle are not subject to the 15-point per battle round scoring limit. There's actually, I think, an error in the Games Workshop scoring app. I believe that it caps your round 5 to 15, even though it is the potential that at the end of round 5, if you have end of game scoring, it actually ends up being potentially up to 25 in some cases. So that's something to keep in mind. Units have all keywords of their models, and attached units have all the keywords of their component units. How are destroyed models taken into account for these purposes? The statements are only as true as long as the models possessing these keywords remain part of the unit. Destroyed models do not contribute their keywords to their prior unit. For example, the aspiring sorcerer model of a Rubric Marine squad is destroyed. None of the remaining models in the unit possess the Psyker keyword. That unit is no longer a Psyker unit. I don't really know where this comes from, to be honest, and I think this could be clarified inside the destroyed model rules, that a destroyed model is removed from play for all rules purposes, except for reviving or returning that model to play. I think that would be a nice clarification to have. That's essentially what the rules say. I think they say that you can't be selected for or affected by any effects or rules while you are destroyed. But the way that they treat destroyed models is that the destroyed model, as soon as it is destroyed and removed from battlefield, essentially ceases to exist until you are looking to sort of bring it back to life, right? Regain wounds or regain models back to that unit. And there's this I guess there's a persistent belief that because it doesn't specify that destroyed models are explicitly removed, I've seen a lot of rules interpretations that say destroyed models sort of remain as ghosts in their unit, for example, which has created some rules confusion. And I think this is pretty clear that this is not meant to be the case. Do units' abilities continue to function while they are embarked within a transport? Yes. The restrictions specified on the ability itself. Embarked units are not on the battlefield, so any ability requiring visibility or measurement to another unit will fail. For example, Karn the Betrayer is attached to a Khorne Berserker unit and embarked within a transport. The Betrayer ability will activate as it has no requirement to be on the battlefield and requires no visibility. That's brutal. Where World Eater players keep winning, I guess. I don't know. Another example is that Azrael is attached to an Intercessor squad and embarked in a transport. This is a very good clarification because this is actually explicitly discussed inside the Space Marine faction pack, but exactly how that rule is meant to be interpreted is a little bit weird. Essentially, the rule is saying that are leadership abilities affecting weapons in a unit still active while that unit is inside a transport? The answer is technically yes, but the faction pack says no, right? The leader is still leading the unit while they are within a transport. So how does that work? They're discussing this here. While Azrael's Supreme Grandmaster ability is still technically active, it will have no effect as the requirements of the ability are not met. The ability affects only weapons equipped by models in the Azrael's unit, and for the purposes of firing deck, the transport itself is equipped with those weapons instead. So Azrael or a lieutenant or whatever is not actually inside the unit that is making ranged attacks with the weapons equipped by its models at the time that they're using firing deck. So abilities that affect your model's weapons do not apply while using them to shoot outside of a transport. So even though all your abilities are still active, because the weapon is being held by the transport and not Azrael's unit. For in this example, Azrael doesn't give them sustained hits, which again is explicit in the Space Marine faction pack, but is kind of worded in a weird and confusing way. Several units included in the Armageddon box currently have different data sheets than those from the official Warhammer 40k app. You should use the Warhammer 40k app one. The Fight on Death rule. This is a whole can of worms. I think I might do a specific video on Fight on Death. I've recorded a video for the fight phase, talking about the fight phase. I mentioned it in the consolidation discussion here. Unfortunately, I didn't include Fight on Death because I wasn't sure if this rule would actually stick around, and it sounds like it might. So it's probably weird enough that it requires its own set of rules or its own video, because it's really wild. So right now, if we look at 050405, which is a clause inside a subsection inside the destroyed model section, it does discuss what happens when you fight on death. And the long and short of it is that a model affected by an ability that allows it to fight after the attacking unit has resolved, even when it's destroyed, preserves you in a state of unlife until such time as your unit is selected to fight normally, regardless of what the timing of that fight on death ability is. And this is so that a lot of the 10th edition fight on death mechanics transpose over to 11th edition. That's how they work. So basically, if I'm being charged and I have a fight on death ability active, any models in my unit that fight on death will remain on the battlefield and just like sort of in a mode of stasis until all my opponent's fights first are done. Then we go back to my turn. Then I select that unit to fight. Then all those models that are in that stasis break out of stasis, fight, and then are destroyed. This creates lots of weird rules connotations because it prevents things like overrun fights in a lot of cases, which is very strange and weird. Fight on Death requires models awaiting such an ability to stay on the battlefield until the unit has attacked or until the end of the phase. How do these models function while this is the case? Models awaiting a Fight on Death ability are still present on the battlefield for all rules purposes. This includes, but is not limited to, the following regarding such models. It can be measured to by friendly or enemies. They can be considered visible to friendly or enemies. They can use their data sheet abilities. They can be targeted by stratagems. Enemy units can still be engaged with them, which may restrict the opposing player's consolidation moves or pile-in moves as part of an overrun fight. So this immediately can make armies with especially a broad spectrum fight on death. So you can things like World Eaters that have like a 4+ fight on death army wide from Blessings of Khorne, or Delve Shift Assault, which can have Chthonian Berserks that all have fight on death abilities like baked in. Any fight on death ability like that can immediately prevent your opponent from doing any like combat chicanery on their turn, which I don't know. It's very weird. So like a good example I think somebody sort of gave to me was that, let's say that you have you're playing World Eaters and you have a Rhino, and the Rhino rolls its fight on death because you have the Blessing of Khorne active and rolls that it's going to fight on death. The Rhino's then destroyed. That Rhino, I believe, because it is considered destroyed but hasn't yet been removed from the battlefield, I actually don't know the timing at which its embarked models disembark, but at the very least, it would prevent enemies, because it's engaging them until such time as it is selected to fight, from then performing an overrun move to attack its embarked units. Its embarked models might not even be on the battlefield at the time that they go to overrun anyway. I'm actually not sure what happens if a transport fights on death. I'm sure that's something I'll have to look into if I do a video about it. Essentially, it can allow you to basically preserve any models that are embarked within that transport, even though the sort of express use case of the overrun ability is that you can attack a transport and then attack the stuff inside of the second unit. So lots of weird corner cases for these kinds of effects. The secondary mission Plunder references one unit within an area terrain that is not within your territory. Yeah, this is one of the biggest like open questions that we've had for secondary missions. Plunder's like really poorly worded, but nobody really knows if it's meant to be the unit or the terrain feature that's being referred to. If it's the terrain feature, it's very difficult to do. If it's the unit, it's very easy to do. So it's kind of a big balance change, whichever one you select. In this case, it is referring to the terrain area, which I believe if you look at it from a purely grammatical standpoint, it is meant to refer to the terrain area. It's just a little bit confusing. I think a lot of people are like, it's a very difficult mission if that is the case. So is it the intention that it's meant to be the terrain area? Because it's one of those missions that you draw early and then you just hold it to like round 5 and you can finally do it. If I select a beacon unit upon drawing the beacon secondary mission, this is the secondary that requires that your beacon unit be alive at the end of your opponent's subsequent turn. Can I select a new beacon unit? The answer is no, which means you will be unable to achieve that mission. we recommend discarding it on your own turn to gain 1 command point. Yeah, I think some of these cards allow you to reselect targets at the start of the turn, I believe, but some of them just select a target, then lock that target in for as long as you have that card in your hand. And in those cases, I guess in Beacon's case, that's the one instance where you just have a potential for the mission to be unscorable. I don't know how often it is that you can have missions that are literally unscorable, not just like unscorable from on an onboard standpoint, but literally functionally unscorable. I think this might be the only one, in fact. Even something like Tempting Target, selects an objective on the battlefield and then retains that objective. And if you ever hold the objective, you can score out your Tempting Target. However, Beacon has the potential to just lose the ability to be scored at all. So anyway, that's the US Open Tacoma FAQ. I think some really good clarifications in there. There are definitely some stuff that needs to continue to be clarified. The Epic Hero thing's a big deal. There is an interaction with Deadly Demise that a lot of people have been bringing up over the last couple of days, where people realize that Deadly Demise refers to all models in its unit exploding when they are destroyed, which is not how that's supposed to work. So if you have a character of Deadly Demise, for example, who attaches into a unit, the entire unit could blow up, which is very funny, but obviously certainly not how the rules are supposed to work. So there's definitely still some work to do. Hopefully we see all those resolved in the July FAQ. But in any case, I'm excited about it. I do think that this does shore up some of the big questions that we had, especially around stuff like Necrons and Awakened Dynasty and how those are actually meant to work. I think this gives us a very good inkling of what we can expect from a July FAQ. And as was discussed in the email when this was released, this is likely to be a preview of the July FAQ because it was written alongside the Warhammer studio team, and a lot of they did specify everything that's covered here will eventually be covered by that FAQ. So exciting stuff. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks as well to everybody who supports. Please come hang out with me over at Ironweld later this weekend, and I'll see you there. Cheers, everybody.